Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Thank you, Sean, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone who came to learn about Chef Sugar. People, if you're not familiar with Chef Sugar, I always like to start with Doug Ireton's quote. This is the very first time that I tweeted about Chef Sugar. It was like the day that it came out, which I'll talk about in a bit. And this was like the first response. So Doug Ireton from Nordstrom has like the coolest thing. It makes me feel super awesome, so I put it in the README. He's like, Chef Sugar? No, more like crème brûlée. It's beautiful Ruby code and exceedingly useful. So I want to talk about both of those things. I want to talk about the beautiful Ruby code, so we are going to look at some code. And I want to talk about its use cases and how it's helping our team internally and lots of other companies and organizations that are using it. Cool. So let's talk about the why. So if you read the talk description, I wanted to do a little bit of a non-technical talk before we started diving into the things. So this is the background of like how Chef Sugar came about. It really started with this particular cook ticket, Cook 494, which was, to summarize, create a core cookbook with useful primitives for system wrangling. For those of you that have been doing Chef for a while, you know that no matter how awesome Chef is, like every operating system has quirks. They have little tweaks. They have little differences, and it can be annoying to try to deal with those. So very early on, I mean, Cook is up to almost 6,000 now, so this is a very, very old ticket. We knew, like at Chef, that this was a thing that we wanted to do. For some context, I graduated high school the year that this Cook ticket was made. It looked like this, obviously this is a Jira ticket. You all have seen it. It said ops code at the time, but I grabbed the screenshot like 3 days ago, so it says Chef now. People came along from the community, some people from Chef, and it kind of became this like collection of nice to haves. It'd be really nice if Chef should do this. And these are things that don't really make sense for Chef Core, or they really didn't at the time. And we just started capturing them on this ticket, and I wanted to go through some of them. So the first one here is the standard configure, make, install stanza for a download tarball. We have a cookbook that does that now. Again, this is super old. It's the Art cookbook that does that and a whole bunch more. So I'm going through this, and I just erased that because we already have it. Cool. Next thing on the list was a search wrapper that defaults to like the node's current environment. A lot of times you do search-specific things based off of where a node resides in your infrastructure, and that seemed like a good idea. So I accepted that and put a green check mark on the slide next to it. And the next one was a helper function that searches for node environment and falls back to node app environment, if you remember that renaming that happened between Chef 9 and 10. Except we were on like Chef 11.10 when I started working on this, so I said that's not really a thing anymore. We're not going to worry about that. And then Seth Chismore came along, who also works at Chef, and said, it'd be really cool if there were these like semantically named platform-specific conditionals, like OSX before Mavericks or Ubuntu after Lucid. And that just sounded really cool to me, because I'm thinking in my head and I'm visualizing a recipe, and Ubuntu 10.04 has like an outdated such and such package for Java, and they only have Java 6 and I need Java 7. I want to be able to surround that in a like Ubuntu before Precise or Ubuntu at Lucid block, instead of checking node platform version, and it's not semantic, and a non-programmer is going to come along and be like, what the hell is this thing with 2F, and I don't know what's going on. So I accepted that as an idea, and I kept going down the list, and there were some more things, and everything that I just told you is like an epic lie. That is not how this happened at all. This is how it should have happened. What really happened is I'd been at Chef for a little over a year, and I moved from community, where I was working on cookbooks and tooling, and I moved into engineering. And I moved into our release engineering team. And now we need to back up and actually talk about how this happened. So this is Chef Sugar. I'm Seth. My last name is Vargo, which isn't important unless you need to find me on Twitter. Then it's super important, because it's actually like 5/9 of the Twitter handle. You might know me from like these things. I wrote Fohi back when I worked at Custom Ink, Chef Spec, Berkshelf, Test Kitchen, Stove. I was the original author of LearnChef.com. And we now have like a whole staff that runs that program. I did some stuff that I talked about in community, and now I'm a release engineer. All of those other things that happened don't really play into this talk at all. It's just to give you some context of where I've been and kind of what influenced a lot of the things that are now in Sugar. So really, sugar boils down to this guard. And you've all done it if you write chef, and it's this thing. And it's super annoying, and you've all done it. You're all laughing. I can hear you laughing. Because no matter what you do, and like the Art Cookbook has this too, at some point you're going to need to compile software from source, or you're going to need to install a tool from source. And while like the configure and the make might be different, it's that not if guard at the end that's like, is this file at this path and executable? And if it is, I don't want to run this, right? Because execute resources aren't idempotent by default. They can't be. There's absolutely no way for them to be. So we, as humans, need to tell the computer when to run and when to not execute that command. But then it gets more complicated because like the new version of Phantom.js comes out, and you're like, how do I get the new version? Oh, I know. I'll just add more conditionals. So first I have to check if the binary exists, because if I ask the binary for its version and it doesn't exist, Chef is going to blow up. So I'll do that, and then I'll add on to that with like, actually shelling out to the thing and asking what its version is, and then grepping for some version number. And then, a couple weeks later, when Vagrant comes out and changes the way they display their version number and the whole ecosystem's broken, I have to change my chef recipes. And then I'm going to like, it started to get long, so I'm going to do some like Ruby magic and make it look a little prettier because it's confusing to me. And this got really old. Like I just got tired of it. It's like really what it boiled down to. And like you start making this dynamic, and you're like, oh, well, the install path is an attribute. So like I'm going to gsub that in, and then like the version is also an attribute because I need to be able to go in and just tune the version at any given time. And your chef recipes don't look like this; they look like this, and it's flying off the side of the page. You're violating 80 character limits. You're like, this isn't fun anymore, right? And at Chef we talk about the this a lot, and one of those things is to fuel the love of Chef. And this doesn't make me want to write Chef. I don't know about you, but this makes me really sad. Like I'm a Ruby developer by trade. I've been a Ruby developer for almost 8 years now. I don't like this code. It's really ugly. And like, if I'm someone like bringing a new person onto my team and they have to look at this code base, that's scary, right? Like that's not the Ruby that we know and love. That's not the Python that we know and love. That's human readable. That's geared towards developer happiness, not machine optimizations. And like I said, I got really sick of that. Like I was going into one cookbook and just copying and pasting and moving into another cookbook. And I have a rule that anytime you're repeating the same pattern over and over again, you probably should fix it. There's the general rule that you see it once, let it go, see it twice, fix it, see it 3 times, shame on you. And I let it get to about 10 before I fixed it. The other thing is that it's really inefficient to shell out. The more times that you actually shell out to the system, the slower your Chef client runs are. And even a test-x or a test-f, a simple little bash or sh is still going to like significantly impact your Chef client runs. Like it has to do that in a subshell. And when you're trying to optimize for speed and deployment, sure, you can deploy 10 times in an hour, but if your Chef client run takes 30 minutes, like that doesn't work. So here's a spoiler alert. We're going to actually go through the Chef Sugar API, but this is one of the things that Chef Sugar offers. Is a handy little installed at version question mark that you can use inside a not if guard, and we're using the Ruby blocks here instead of the actual string, which is interpreted as sh, and it's super simple to pipe in some node attributes in there. And then what if you don't care about the version? Let's go back, right? Like what if you only care that Phantom.js is installed and it doesn't really matter what version it's at? Well, there's just a cool little installed thing that takes the name of a binary. Why is this cool? Because this doesn't actually shell out to the system until it has to. So this will inspect the path environment variable, which is what shelling out is going to do anyway. And that's all done in Ruby in the current process, so it's basically instantaneous to the human eye. And if that binary is not found, we never shell out and ask what its version is. So we can immediately know that we need to install software, or we know that we can shell out and move on. What's cool is a lot of times you have really complicated, right? Like, for whatever reason, we need a version of something that is less than 5.0, because 5.0 included breaking changes, and we can't update yet because it conflicts with this other software version. But we also can't have 4.1, because 4.1, they changed the license to like the WTF license, and like legal didn't like that. So we have to not have 4.1. With Chef Sugar, it's super easy. You just use version 4, which is going to return the string that comes back for the version, and then we can coerce that to a float and just compare and say, hey, like, these are the versions that we need. So kind of here's how Chef Sugar came about. I wrote that thing, just that thing. And I was going to call it Chef Shell Helpers, which gets shortened to like Chef Shell Hell. And I was like, I went to Seth Chismore and I said, hey, dude, look at this thing that I wrote. It's pretty cool. He was like, dude, that's pretty cool. And I went to Stephen Dana and I was like, Stephen, you used to work on cookbooks. Like, isn't this thing cool, right? And I was like piping up my ego, you know, like getting a little taller. You know. Then I went to Josh Timberman and I was like, dude, you got to see this. And they all said the same thing to me. So Seth Chismore was like, I was like, yo, dog, look what I made. And Seth Chismore was like, dude, I think there's an open source ticket for that. And Stephen Dana was like, yeah, there's definitely an open source ticket about that. And then Josh was like, yeah, seriously, there's an open source ticket for that. You should definitely go take a look at it. So we started having some conversations about those things on that ticket and what was useful and what was not useful in the context of just time had grown and the needs of the community were different. And that's where Cook 494 really came into my life. That was when I actually found out about Cook 494. It was after I'd already written Chef Sugar. It was just called something different. So I went to that ticket. We talked about it as a team and some community people and decided this was the thing that we wanted to do. So I put on my party hat. Like my party hat? It's pretty awesome, right? I hopped on an airplane off to LAX with my dream in my car again. That was a Miley Cyrus reference for those of you that didn't get it. I might have drank a little bit on the plane. But when I landed in Seattle, I had written Chef Sugar without any internet access, using only the things on my laptop. It was not bug-free. I'm not that good. That's how Chef Sugar came about. It was really an airplane ride from Pittsburgh to Seattle with a whole bunch of conversations that happened in between, which is something that's super important to talk about. Had I gone off in a box and built this software, which I already admitted is what I started to do, it wouldn't have been successful. Because the ideas that I had were great, but it turned out that there was so much more that it could be. And I want to talk about what it is in a second, but I really want to hammer that point home that you can't build software in a box. It doesn't matter whether you're writing an extension to Chef like Chef Sugar or you're writing a cookbook, you can't go off in a box and build that. It doesn't work. It will fail. Cool. So this is my pun on all languages. While I drink water awkwardly. So let's look at some of these awesome APIs. The first one is cloud. And there's actually a whole bunch of matchers, and I've air quoted the word cloud. Virtual cloud, public cloud, private cloud, I don't really care what it is. There's a cloud attribute, and it returns true if you are running on something that looks like a cloud. What does that mean? Go look at the code. There's also these submatchers that are super useful, right? How many people run stuff on like EC2 or AWS? Yeah, so there's an EC2 question mark method in Chef Sugar. And a lot of times you have to do crazy things on EC2, just for EC2. Like, I don't know, you need to like set up a VPC. And like, you don't want to do that in your Vagrant environment, because if you try to set up VPC on your Vagrant environment, Vagrant's going to be like, what? Same thing for Rackspace, right? There's like little things in Rackspace that are different. There's little things in DigitalOcean that are different. And we have query methods for all of those things. Because those quirks exist in every one of these providers, sometimes like, as nice as it would be to have all of our chef recipes execute the same on all of our infrastructure, sometimes that's just not possible, as I'm sure you know. So the cloud methods really help with that. There's also a cloud method called best_IP_for, best_IP_for, which basically what it does is it'll use the internal IP address of the node that it calculates from a chef search instead of the external one. So for those of you that use AWS, you're like, holy, that's going to save me money. Because you don't have to pay those bandwidth costs because it's on your internal network. And that's super useful. Super, super useful, and it saves money, which makes managers happy. Databags. I hate typing chef : encrypted databag item because I never spell it right, ever. And it's really annoying. And I look at a recipe and I want it to be beautiful, and I see like encrypted databag, or I see databag and I see databag item, and it looks so nice. And I'm like, why is there no encrypted databag item? So I made one. And this is really just a tiny little Ruby method that wraps chef encrypted databag.load, and it makes your recipes look clean. You don't have to have this weird Ruby class. right? So take yourself out of the context of someone who has Ruby experience, and you just hired, whether it's some kid out of college or an experienced C programmer. They're not going to look at this and be intimidated. They're going to say, oh, I'm just going to assume that this encrypted databag item is a thing that Chef provides because I already saw a databag item and I already saw search and these other helpful methods. I don't have to dig down into the Ruby core. Attributes are cool. I don't actually use this, I'm going to be honest, but there was a lot of request for it. So I built it because people liked it. And I fully understand that I'm not everyone. I prefer what's on the top, which is just using the simple array definition for what is there. In fact, our team has started using Ruby's tap object for this, which I was talking about yesterday. However, in Chef Sugar, there's actually a namespace key that I define on attribute that allows you to define attributes in a Ruby DSL. So much like the recipe DSL uses method missing, the namespace DSL also uses method missing. And these are functionally equivalent. For me, I prefer the top because I'm a Ruby developer, and that makes sense to me. For someone else, this bottom section might be more awesome. The cool thing about the bottom section is you can wrap conditionals around those attributes inside the namespace because it's evaluated as a block, which you can't really get with the whole top thing. You have to actually define the full namespace each time. And there's some additional stuff that goes in here. You can set precedence levels. I didn't want to complicate the examples, but there are more in the README. And I can do like demos at office hours if anybody wants to actually see. But this is super cool, especially for people who don't like the hash syntax. We're going to talk about the hash syntax in a little bit. Constraints. I see this a lot in community cookbooks where whether you're doing graceful degradation or feature enhancement, you need to like compare the version of Chef that you're running with, this only works on Chef 10, this only works on Chef 11, or this only worked on this one version of Chef Client because there was a bug in it or something. It happens all the time. And we see it a lot with like gems too and tools where you don't care which version of Phantom.js is installing, going back to our very original example. You just care that it's in the 16.0 series. And you can use the pessimistic operator for that. The way that you do that is either by using Chef version constraint, which doesn't support pre-release, or you use gem constraint and gem version. And this is really ugly. Again, this goes back to, this is intimidating to me. Like, I'm not a Ruby developer. I am a Ruby developer. But the person reading this is not a Ruby developer. This is not happy. It does not condone happiness. It makes me sad. It makes them confused. It's intimidating. It's not good. What we have in Chef Sugar is not only a chef_version, a method that exists everywhere that returns a version object that you can query, but you can just call like .satisfies on it, or .greater than, or .less than, and pass it in a thing, and it evaluates to true or false. We're going to see core extensions in a little bit, but you can actually do the same thing with raw string objects. You can just say like quote 1.0.0 satisfied by like, spermie equivalent 2.1, and it's going to return false. While we're talking about gems, if you're ever writing libraries, this sucks. Like if you depend on Nokogiri, getting Nokogiri installed is a pain in the butt, or anything really, any third-party gem that you need to use in a library. You require the thing, and if the person didn't include your recipe the way that you clearly explained in the manual, they're going to get this really ugly load error that's like not helpful. It's like, could not load Nokogiri, blah, 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 huge stack trace. And again, I'm not a Ruby developer. That's stupid. Why would I want to use Chef? This stuff sucks. Like, I'm going home. Whereas if you look at RequiredChefGem, which is super simple, it just wraps require and rescues load error. It gives a simple, informative message to the user that says, hey, here's this gem that you told me to get. I couldn't do it. I don't know why I couldn't do it, but I couldn't load it. You should definitely look at the README, because RTFM, and you should definitely look at the documentation, because I bet that there's something in there that says you need to do something, that there's a prerequisite step before you can use this cookbook. You could very easily replicate this on your own. In fact, I was doing a simple thing like this in cookbooks, but RequiredChefGem is just a lot nicer. It's worth noting that RequiredChefGem has nothing to do with like the chef_gem resource that's part of Core Chef, so don't confuse them. This is just an extension on the kernel module. So if you are writing a library that's consumed by other people, you should definitely look into using RequiredChefGem to make your life easier. Deep fetch. If you don't like the bracket notation, you can use node deep fetch, which allows you to specify an arbitrary list of arguments that get fetched down into the hash. So if you look, like as far as line length goes, obviously the deep fetch is more typing. There are more characters here. So that sucks. Why would you want to do that? Well, how convenient. I have another slide. So if you had a bad key here, right? You're spelling something incorrectly or you're interpolating this key and you go and, the way Ruby works is this is going to return a hash and this is going to return nil because that key doesn't exist. Then you're going to call bracket on nil, which is where you get this error from. And if you're like new to Chef, you're going to see this error within the next 24 hours. I guarantee it. It is the #1 cause of Chef frustration. And it's super uninformative. So I made it informative. If you call deep fetch, it just returns nil, right? And you're thinking like, well, I don't want that. Why would I want it to return nil? I want it to blow up. Sometimes you don't actually care and you want it to return nil. But in Ruby, we don't like methods that raise exceptions to like be like that. We like methods that raise exceptions and perform destructive operations to end in a bang. So we have that too, which is deep fetch bang or deep fetch exclamation point, which not only will blow up, which is what you want, but it will return a nice message that's like, hey, this thing didn't exist. And in fact, the newest version of Chef Sugar will actually tell you which key produced the nil error. The problem with like deep fetch is it's an API change. It's not a thing that you can just like dump in and require. You actually have to go through and change the way that you're accessing node attributes. But it's super, super helpful, especially if you're, especially if bad key here is like Chef environment, right? Which isn't super obvious whenever the thing comes back and it's like, nope, I don't know what you meant about nil something colon stack trace. We already talked a little bit about platforms. So I'm sure you've all done this if you're writing any type of cross-platform cookbook. If we're on Ubuntu, do this. Chef Sugar gives you an Ubuntu question mark method. Doesn't care what version it is, it's just Ubuntu question mark. Named platforms, right? Specific names, especially for platforms that give these semantic names for whatever reason. You have Ubuntu and Debian and OS X, which are notorious for naming their releases. And humans are semantic. We don't like to talk about 10.9. We like to talk about Mavericks. So this is what I was talking about before with like Ubuntu before precise. There's a whole load of them. And if you are like at all interested, you should go look at the code that generates this because I don't write all of these methods. They're dynamically generated at runtime. It's pretty freaking sweet. And platform families are the same thing. So Debian is like kind of the overarching platform that encompasses a bunch of different things. And then one of the last things I want to talk about is filters, which is if you ever do this wonderful thing where you create a resource and you call .runaction on it at the end so that it goes at compile time instead of converge time because you need the package so that you can install your thing before you do your thing. That's gone with Chef Sugar. There's a compile time block. And everything that you put in between that do and end will get executed at compile time. So no more nasty run action, no more any of that. It's just a block. If you look at the Build Essential Cookbook, there's a variation of this called potentially at compile time that I added, which made the code a lot cleaner and unfortunately confused some people. But this is a way to significantly clean up those ugly conditionals with the ternary operators to just something that's clean. And if I'm not a Ruby developer, this bottom feels a lot more like Chef. Feels like what I want to see, not crazy things. And that's basically all of Chef Sugar in a nutshell. There's more API methods. There's more awesomeness that's baked into the README. But that's really it. It's not super exciting. In fact, the code is really only 500 lines of code, and most of it's docs. But I wanted to dive into like some technical details because I feel like some people are interested in that. But I have a stop sign that I made in Keynote because the stuff that I'm going to talk about is technical. And if you don't care about that, then I'm sorry, it's not relevant. You can still use it. But I feel like there are other people who actually want to hear how this thing works. And that would be cool. So I'm going to talk about it. But I didn't want to just jump into that without like warning you that I'm going to talk about code. So this is the structure of the actual Chef Sugar project. And I know the first thing you're thinking is it's a gem spec and it's a cookbook. So it's a gem and a cookbook. That doesn't work. They're two different things. How is that possible? In fact, they're versioned together. So version 1.0 of the gem and version 1.0 of the cookbook are the same thing. Yes, it's both. It's actually one of the few projects that is both the gem and the cookbook. And if you go to Jamie Windsor's talk later in the day, he's actually going to talk about what they're doing in Undead Labs, which is very similar, where they're putting their chef cookbooks inside their application. That's a very small, like Chef Sugar is a very small representation of that idea. Yeah, the answer is yes. So I'm going to use the zoom and enhance technology that they use on Law and Order Special Victims Unit all the time to zoom into this particular part. Under lib chef sugar, each one of these things are kind of logically grouped into files. And we have like architecture, which you can query for like 64-bit or 32-bit architecture. There's array, core extensions. And really what one of those files looks like, we'll see in a second, really depends on what sugar RB is. So this is the main class that gets loaded. And there's some requiring of files. And then at the very bottom, we just include the Chef Sugar DSL into recipe, resource, and provider, which are the 3 core classes for Chef if you're familiar with like the way that the ecosystem works together. We'll talk about that in a second. Just back of your mind, throw that back there for a second. So let's look at shell. Shell is the first thing that I wrote. The very first thing to look at is that it's like chef : sugar : shell. So everything's namespaced under chef sugar. And it's a self-extending module. So for those of you that don't have a Ruby background, what that means is that you can include this module and you'll get all these methods. But you can also call chef : sugar : shell .which. Outside of the recipe, or outside of everything, you can use it as a straight up library. You don't have to include it, you don't have to mix it in. Some people claim this is an anti-pattern. I think they're wrong. Then you define the methods that you want. So there's a whole bunch of methods in here like which and version 4 and installed it version. And then at the very bottom, there's a DSL. And this is under chef DSL, like chef sugar DSL. And we define that method and it basically just calls the module method. So this is kind of a proxy in a way to the parent method of the module. And we do this for every method that exists in all of the classes. So then when you go back to sugar, again, this was in the back of your mind from about 30 seconds ago, when we're including the chef sugar DSL, what's actually happening is we're including all of those methods that are defined at the bottom of those files. And those methods are actually just calling the top level module methods that have the same name. They don't have to have the same name, but semantics are cool. So core extensions are evil, and you should never use core extensions. So I added a bunch to chef sugar. Because core extensions aren't actually evil. That's a misconception. What's evil is requiring them by default. You should not force people to use your core extensions. So this is my recipe, and I want core extensions. If I just include chef sugar : default, that's going to install chef sugar for me. It's awesome. It's going to require it too. But if I want the core extensions for version comparing, I actually have to require that. That's a thing that I, as a user, need to opt into because that could conflict with other things in my code base, especially a very large one. So I can require chef sugar's core extensions, and that's going to give me this awesome version 1.2.3.satisfy something. I can just call satisfies on directly on a string object. Or given an array of constraints, I can call .satisfied by on that array of constraints. And again, these aren't included by default because you may already have a satisfies method on your string, and I don't want to stomp on your toes. So you have the ability to choose on core extensions. And if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, don't do this because you're going to confuse yourself. Just use chef sugar, and you'll be OK. And if you care about this, you should do it. It's cool, and I'm putting 2 thumbs up. That's it. That's all of chef sugar in a nutshell. All of the code is on GitHub. You can find the original blog post, which was Spice Up Your Recipes with Chef Sugar, which is coincidentally the title of this talk. It's just so catchy. The code is on GitHub. It's Seth Vargo /chef-sugar. And there's actually an InfoQ article on it. It was published on InfoQ, and there's a little blurb in there if you're curious about what's going to make it into core and what might not make it into core, and some reasons behind that. That's pretty much all I have. I have no idea where I am with respect to time, so I don't know if I'm allowed to ask if there are any questions. You have 15 minutes left. Cool, that's exactly how much time I wanted for questions. No, I'm just kidding. So that's chef sugar in a nutshell. And really what it boils down to is we want to make chef delightful. We want to make chef delightful. And chef sugar is one of the many tools in the ecosystem that are going to help you do that. So whether you're an experienced Ruby developer and you want to go look at the code and be like, this is cool, I like this pattern, or criticize it and tell me about it privately, whichever one you want to do, I'm cool with both. It's a valuable tool that I encourage you to use in your infrastructure. At least try it, and if it doesn't work, then hit me on Twitter and I'll get sad, and then I'll fix it. or I'll try to. I can't promise I'll fix it, but I'll try to. I know like internally we've been using it for everything that our team does. And every new cookbook we write, the first dependency that we inject in the metadata is Chef Sugar. It's received hundreds of thousands of downloads as a gem, the equivalent number of downloads by like a factor of 100 on the community cookbook site. It's becoming increasingly popular, and I'm super excited about it. I know I'm kind of monotone, so I don't sound super excited about it, but I'm super excited about it. I don't know how many of you are using Chef Sugar and just kind of came here to hear me tell you what you already knew or were curious about what it's about. I do want to talk about that. But you know, as far as code goes, it's beautiful code. That's what Doug Ireton said in the beginning. We're iterating on it. We found this really cool bug feature in Java. Feature in Java where when you ask Java for its version, which by the way is not dash version or -v, it's dash version, it outputs that to standard error, not standard out. So things like version 4 just don't work because I'm only checking standard out. And that was a bug that Seth Chismore tracked down, and you know, we patched it up, and now the version 4 checks both standard out and standard error because Java just kept installing every time. Yeah. Yeah. You're not missing anything. So everything that I talked about prior to core extensions, you totally get. All of that. This is the only thing that you don't get with core extensions. So I don't want to touch the screen because that'd be weird. So you get that with Chef Sugar, right? So you have to wrap the string with the version, and then you can call .satisfies on it. So this method returns an object that you can call satisfies on. The core extension mixes this part into the string class, like Ruby's core string class. So you can actually just call .satisfies right on the string. What I don't have an example for is it also mixes into an array. So the flip side of this is satisfied by. So given a constraint, does a version satisfy it? If you have an array of like 3 or 4 constraints, you can call .satisfied by on that array and give it a version, and it'll return true or false. That's all you get with core extensions, and that's why I don't harp on them and kind of skimmed over them. But it is nicer in a recipe to type the bottom than it is to wrap in a version. Although I would argue that this is a little more semantic, but this might be less intrusive to a new Ruby developer. So it's a give and take. Yep, it's just a dependency in the metadata. The reason that you might run into problems with a base cookbook is if you want, like when we found that bug in Chef Sugar, we wanted to iterate Chef Sugar so that we could, we patched it and released a new version, and we wanted to bump the new version in the cookbook we were working on. If we had a base cookbook, we would have to go through lots of business units to make sure that that upgrade worked. There'd be more testing, more pomp and circumstance. So we just have a dependency. And every cookbook we write, new and like ones that we're revamping, we just add it as a dependency in the metadata. And that allows it to be versioned independently. We don't have to worry nearly as much about the, you run the possibility of conflicting versions, but depth selectors are pretty good about that now. Yeah?
So you talked about it being able to be a gem for a cookbook. If you're including it as a cookbook in all of your cookbooks, where's the gem part coming?
Cool, great question. And I was going to put this on a slide, and I didn't because I didn't think it was important. Turns out it was. So in terms of structure, there's a metadata.rb. The metadata.rb is actually compiled into JSON when it gets uploaded to the server. The version of the metadata.rb is actually pulled from like Chef Sugar : capital version, like the gem constant, and it's just interpolated and like pushed up at runtime. What does that mean? That means the recipe just calls ChefGem with like Chef Sugar as the name, and the version attribute is whatever version the current gem is when that cookbook was published. Does that make sense? A little bit? Okay. To explain it another way, the recipe itself is dependent on the version of the gem that it's packaged with. So Chef Sugar Cookbook 1.0.0 installs version 1.0.0 of the Chef Sugar gem and then requires it. Like the recipe for Chef Sugar is seriously like 4 lines of code. It's like chefgem, chef-sugar, version, whatever dynamic version it is, end space require chef-sugar. That's the whole recipe. So you're still downloading from Ruby gems, right? You're not, there's a development recipe that'll compile locally for source, but that's mostly for me to do testing.
So the fact that it's a gem does not mean that I use ChefGem to install it. It's just how the cookbook gets there instead of downloading a cookbook.
Kind of. You could totally not use chef sugar : default and not use the chef sugar cookbook, and you could still run like chef_gem chef sugar and install it yourself, and you would get the gem. And you could also, in like a third-party project that is not using anything chef related, you could still use a lot of these mix-ins and just require the gem, which I actually just did yesterday. So they're logically grouped, but they're not tightly coupled. They're only tightly coupled for convenience, not because of actual like integration. They don't have to be together.
In general, though, as a cookbook developer, we should be saying include recipe ChefGem.
Yes.
Nothing about the gem.
Correct.
Chef Sugar.
Chef Sugar, yeah. Unless you are actually like developing on Chef Sugar, in which case that's a different topic. What else?
Any worries about compatibility going forward?
In terms of?
Just Chef Sugar working with future versions of Chef?
So we've gotten much better internally about making sure that breaking changes are well known, and we're exercising that in the community now. Yes, I have concerns. Without like diving too deep in the code, I'm not using any Chef API other than this. Like the only thing that's actually Chef in any of this are these 3 lines of code, which I'll go to the slide that has them a little darker. So these 3 lines of code, chef recipe, chef resource, and chef provider, like .send include, which is just a Rubyism, that's the only thing that's coupled with chef. Everything else is just straight up Ruby. So unless like chef recipe, chef resource, and chef provider change, which I will say is very unlikely at this point, they're very stable APIs, Chef Sugar will just continue to work. In terms of backwards compatibility within itself, they're sugars, right? They're just wrappers around already existing things that you could do. It's just making things prettier, it's making things easier. You know, the best IP for method is really just like a really nasty search block that you can already do that. If the API for search changes, then yeah, we'll have to update that and handle that accordingly. But because it's just sugar, it's not actually logic. Like there's no logical computation that happens anywhere in Chef Sugar. It's just wrappers around things. So there's very few APIs that are coupled with the gem/cookbook. The cook gem, the gem book. I don't know what I want to call it. Let's hear from this half of the room. You guys are all quiet. You, red shirt, you look like you have a question. No? Okay. No? You sure? Yeah, what's up?
Version 4, does that work on...
Wait, stop. Sean.
Yes.
Sean. There are 4 Seans in the front of the room. Go on, sorry.
All in a row.
Yeah, all in a row.
Version 4, does that work on Windows as well?
Yes, so the path stuff will definitely work on Windows. The installed at version should work on Windows because what it tests the path for finding like the binary, which it uses like file separator, which is Ruby knows is different on Windows and Linuxy things, and then it shells out. So as long as mixlib shellout does the right thing on Windows, then it'll work. And if mixlib shellout doesn't do the right thing on Windows, we should fix that in mixlib shellout, and then Chef Sugar will work on Windows.
It doesn't do like a test-d or
No. It literally shells out to like path to binary -- version, and it collects all of that info. So if that works, then it'll work.
Why did you say releases in Jam
So that's detailed in the InfoQ article. I can touch on it a bit. Really what it boils down to is that just like the Linux kernel, getting things into Chef Core is really slow. And until this API is like stable, and there have been some changes, and until like we as a community, right, because this isn't my project, right? It lives under my GitHub namespace, but like I said, I don't use that namespace attribute stuff. Other people wanted that. And until we get to a point where this is stable and I feel comfortable saying, okay, let's move this into core and we can have discussions and like internally as a company figure out what that looks like, it makes sense for this to iterate on its own, kind of outside of that ecosystem, outside of that relatively slow process compared to how quickly I can release a gem. The advantage is like its namespace. You'll notice this is class chef, not module chef, because chef itself is a class. It's relatively easy to integrate into Chef Core. It's just really a matter of like, it doesn't make sense to put this into core and then find out people don't like this one thing or they want to change this other thing. And now we have to wait until a major version release because that's a breaking change. Whereas here we can iterate on it. Like, I hope that you guys can help me gain popularity around it. And as a community, we can come together, find out exactly what UX, really this is UX, what UX around Chef do we want to change, do we want to see implemented? And at that point, once we're solidified and this is stable, we can start moving pieces into Chef Core. Is really what it's really about speed. And we're working on getting Chef faster and testing like the Chef client out faster. But like the fact of the matter is, I could release a new version of this right now, and we have to test Chef client. These tests run in 0.014 seconds, all of them. Chef client, it might be like a couple hours. So. It's just speed.
Yeah. It's a common pattern we use also, like the Windows cookbook won't be the Windows cookbook forever. Right?
Yeah.
So we're just prototyping outside of the core.
Yeah, and a good example of something that like went through that process is John Kaiser's Knife Essentials. Yeah. It was a knife plugin / cookbook. It gradually made its way as a dependency of core, and then that code itself just moved into core, and we dropped the dependency. And now Knife Essentials is for people who use Chef 10 and lower. And Chef 11 has Knife Essentials built in. So it's a slower process, and like Sean number 3 said, we have experience with it. Windows Cookbook is going to go away. I don't know when that's happening, but it's definitely going to happen. So there's precedence for like doing this. Yeah.
Do you have any plans to implement something that would help people find where they could make their code prettier? And especially things like .run action is something that you could scrape through a cookbook and detect and recommend, hey, you can actually make this look better and give you food critic. Does food critic already do this?
It could.
So the question is, are we going to implement Chef Sugar into food critic?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't personally have a plan to do that. I also probably won't be the person who pioneers the move of Chef Sugar into core. Like, I want that to be a community effort. Like, I have a vested interest in getting this in core, right? Like, I want this in core. But that's my own personal thing, and that might not be what other people want. So that's why I want, like, lots of support for this. I want people to come together and start using it. Like, I want to see the issues on GitHub. I want to see the pull requests. Because that shows me that this is something people care about. Because right now, I know there's like 4 people who care about this, and I work with 2 of them. So like, I'm super excited. Like, I've seen what people are saying about it, but like, I don't see the level of activity that I want. And maybe that means it's perfect. Maybe that means that like I haven't talked about it enough. And I'm hoping that in talking about it here and getting it into people's infrastructure, that we start seeing it grow. As far as like making a rule to say that you should switch to Chef Sugar, like, frankly, like, my ego's not big enough to make people to do that. Like, I do it when I see it, but I don't see the advantage of being like, you should use this third-party tool because it's going to make your code look prettier. Like, that's a thing that managers decide, not developers. That's really a question for like the maintainers of tools like Rubocop and Food Critic, who are writing those. I guess you could call that a lint or like a best practice thing. I don't really know where that falls. Cool. I think I have time for one last question because they're clapping next door. Or I can stand up here awkwardly for another 15 seconds.
VI or Emacs?
VI or you should come to the band thing tonight, and you'll hear what my favorite editor is.
Okay.
It may be in the form of a rap. And it is neither of those. Cool. Well, like I said, the code is on GitHub. Maybe the code is on GitHub. Yeah, the code is on GitHub. Please open issues. Please open pull requests. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh, these slides will be on speaker deck as soon as I stop talking. All of my slides are on speaker deck if you want to see the other things that I've talked about in my life too. Yes, these slides will be on speaker deck. It's speakerdeck.com/Seth Vargo. I will tweet out the link. If you follow me on Twitter, you can get that. Yes, please help me make this awesome. Or please tell me if you think it's stupid and I can stop telling people about it. But one of those two things will happen. I'm done talking.